Welcome back, everyone, to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Major General Mick Ryan, AM, retired. Although it's hard to actually describe Mick as retired in that official designation, because I haven't known anyone who's left the Defence Force who's been so ultra active in areas that are still incredibly relevant to all of the current issues and debates out there around current conflict strategy and geopolitics. And Mick is eminently equipped to do that because he spent 35 years serving our nation. He served it in operational contexts in Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He also served at command in just about every meaningful field level unit and formation that we have in the Australian Defence Force. But going on from that in very senior roles such as the commander of the Australian Defence College, where he was helping us to generate the future leaders of our Defence Force, and leaders who will be well-rounded in their understanding, knowledge and contextualising their roles as defence personnel in the challenges of a democratic society, contesting spaces in this world and defending itself. So in that context, Mick's been a really highly sought-after commentator, but also really continuing to contribute to academic discussions and thought through prolific contributions and articles and books. He's a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University's School of International Studies, and also the Marine University's Advanced Warfare School. So we couldn't possibly find someone more qualified to have a chat today about the issue that we'll be talking about, the war in Ukraine. Mick has really done a deep dive on this. He's written a book, an outstanding book on that, as well as two other books, which we'll talk about later, The Future of Warfare, and also a novel to do with the potential of conflict over Taiwan and with China. And that's also compulsory reading for anyone who wants to cast forward of what the world might look like. It's effectively a bit of wargaming in a novel form. So thank you for your contributions and your service to the nation, Mick. It's been an incredible career and continuing to be so. As we've mentioned, we do these deep dives on these current issues, and we have done a historical survey of the background to the war in Ukraine. So now today, we'd really like to talk through the nuts and bolts of that. So we see this huge monolithic giant in military terms, at least that was the perception of Russia as the war broke out. And I think most people believed, well, if Russia throws their full strategic military weight at the Ukraine, there's going to be, no chance of Ukraine holding that back, and it will all be over in relatively short order. And that didn't happen. And so how do you describe how this war began, and what were the mechanics that enabled Ukraine to survive that onslaught?
Well, I think one of the really important drivers of the first few months of the war was Putin's assumptions about the war. He made three really big assumptions in his calculus, his strategic calculus about going to war. The first one was that the government of Ukraine would probably flee at the first crossing of Russian troops into Ukraine, and that he could replace them pretty quickly. The second assumption that he made was that the Ukrainian military was similar to the one that they'd fought in 2014, and that it hadn't really changed, was still reasonably poorly led. And the third big assumption he made was that NATO and the United States would behave pretty much like they did in the wake of his illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. You probably could have got one of those assumptions wrong and done all right, but he got all three wrong. You saw the president of Ukraine, who was very unpopular at that point, step up, unify his people, and unify the opinion of many countries, not all countries, but many countries around the world, to support Ukraine. You saw the Ukrainian military perform extraordinarily well, and I've been to some of the early battlefields at Hostomel and Moshun, and they performed extraordinarily well. And you saw NATO and the United States throw in behind Ukraine pretty quickly. Some countries, in particular the UK, straight away. It was amazing to see. It gave the Ukrainians heart, but also gave them the capacity to hold out and basically win the first phase of the war. So that was the context of the first couple of months of the war. Um, we've seen multiple different phases of the war since then, whether the shift to the east, the attrition phase, the different offensives and counter-offensives. And indeed, this is a war that is different every 5 or 6 months. I mean, you have to keep going back because if you think you knew the war a year ago, you no longer do. It is a very quickly changing strategic environment and frontline environment
Mhm.
that demands constant attention and study.
Right. And Mick, it seemed from the reports we were getting and some of the actions of Putin that perhaps, and I guess you often get this with dictators where they'll surround themselves with yes men, but it seemed that the intelligence that he was shaping his approach on was that all you need to do is drive an armoured column down the main road into the Ukraine. There'll be an instant collapse and the government will flee the nation, run away. You'll see the last of Zelenskyy. Then you can set yourself up your puppet government, sign a piece of paper that assigns them Luhansk and Donetsk, etc., and gives up Crimea, and you'll have your result. And so no need to worry about all the logistics and combined arms, strategy and approach and all that sort of stuff. So, and it seems that it was clearly the approach: just drive down the main highway and hope for the best, with a bit of air operations around the airport with Spetsnaz and whatnot. But one of the indicators that seemed to back that up is that he arrested the head of his intelligence services and put him under house arrest not long after the failure of the first assault. So is that your reading of how things panned out initially?
Yeah, it was certainly a contributor. Interestingly, if you have a look at the RAND report that looks at the 2014 Russian operations, the Russian intelligence predicted exactly the same thing and got it wrong back then.
Right.
So they don't have great form when it comes to Ukraine, which is a little mystifying because they should know them really, really well, just as the Ukrainians know the Russians really, really well. So it wasn't the only determinant of the first couple of months of the war's outcome, but it certainly was an important one in shaping Putin's assumptions. And I think probably for the first couple of months of the war, he was maybe overprotected against bad news. That's a feature of the system, not a glitch in it. It's a feature of over centralization of decision making, punishing those who bring bad news and these kind of things.
Right. So, effectively, we see that first phase of the ability of the Ukrainians to really blunt that first wave. And it seems also that in doing that, we had a situation where already they were applying some asymmetric techniques to assist with that in terms of how they were, I guess, decapitating a lot of the command and control aspects in the early days and really hindering the logistics aspect of it too, by striking rear area headquarters and the like, and seemingly being able to really accurately pinpoint commanders' movements, etc. Was that a really important feature of that early phase? Or
I think it was. You got to remember that the Ukrainians have been fighting the Russians since 2014.
Mhm.
Many of the most senior leaders came up fighting the Russians in Donbass, whether it was Zelenskyy, whether it was ground forces commanders or brigade commanders. They've all come up learning about and fighting the Russians, so they know them. They've studied them. They've attended their schools.
Right.
Siersky was born in Russia, so they know their enemy well. It's a bit like, the Confederates and the Union armies during the American Civil War. They know each other well. They know the commanders. So that was an important part of the tactics the Ukrainians chose. Remember, they've also been learning from NATO about mission command. They're not totally a NATO military, and not everyone uses mission command, but there was parts of that particularly advocated for by Zelenskyy. But they also understood they were the small dog. Ukraine could not fight like the big dog. It had to be the small dog, and small dogs have to be clever and hit where they can, where it will hurt their adversary the most. And that was largely how they chose to operate. My last visit to Ukraine, actually got to talk to the Take Brigade commander, who was very decisive in the outcome of the battles around Chernihiv and these kind of places. And they were outnumbered, in an extraordinary way, but fought cleverly against an enemy that was very arrogant and just assumed the Ukrainians would run away.
Hmm. And so, we get this initial ability to, I guess, blunt the first wave. But I think what shocked a lot of people too was that, okay, you can understand maybe the assumptions were flawed and, you have to recalibrate, but now bring to bear, what we all assumed was just a type of strategic weight that wouldn't be able to be resisted. And so we have to ask the question, why didn't that effort mobilise and why wasn't it effective? Were we all, I guess, making false assumptions ourselves about Russian military capability? Had that been diminished through lack of investment or lack of sustainment maintenance or overconfidence? What was the real story behind Russian military capability at that point?
Well, I think too many Western analysts had bought Russian propaganda about the 10 years of reform. There were some who pointed out weaknesses. We've got to be fair to them. There were some who were pointing out systemic weaknesses and corruption and bad leadership and these kind of things. So I don't think we had an accurate picture of the Russians as they crossed the border. But more to the point, we had an even less accurate picture of the Ukrainians. I don't know a single analyst who had done in-depth studies of Ukrainian military capacity in the lead up to the war. I only know one person who actually has written an article about Ukraine in its military performance before February 2022, and that's the person talking to you right now.
Right.
I wrote an article back in 2014 looking at the lessons from the Ukrainian for the Australian Army. So, I think we didn't know the Russians well, but we knew the Ukrainians even less. And I think that had a very significant role in the outcome of the war and our expectations of what might happen in the first week. Now, of course, the whole industry's grown up and there's trillions of Ukrainian and Russian experts out there now. This is a niche that's overflowing. Not with a lot of good quality, but there are some good quality analysts that have emerged over the last few years.
And I guess there was the geopolitical dimension to this as well. And a lot of people have reflected, and I was reflecting on this too, that there were quite a few similarities to the 1930s in the circumstances we've been in recently. And, the question of the lessons learned from appeasement and how you confront autocrats, etc. How do you deter and prevent war in the first place by drawing some really sharp red lines? Do you think if, for example, we'd seen a Kennedy moment from President Biden, who obviously had all the intelligence indicating that there was going to be an invasion, if they and perhaps Europeans had come out and said, look, we'll regard any attack on Ukraine as an attack on the West and we'll retaliate fully in response and, put skin in the game. Do you think that would have deterred the Russian invasion?
Possibly. I mean, I know there's some who speculate that this war was a failure of deterrence. It's hard to know whether Russia actually could have been deterred. I mean, what Putin is doing is absolutely the same as Hitler and his living space, right? Exactly the same. This is about Russian spheres of influence, living space, the extermination of other cultures on its borders. They are the 21st century Nazis here. But I think the point with America, Europe, and Australia in particular, there was still a deep complacency about large-scale war, whether it was even possible anymore. I think most people intellectually could not accept that a large-scale war could occur in Europe in the 21st century. I mean, just Norman Angle on steroids in many respects. And there are still many who think that, even with the evidence of the last 3 years. Certainly in Australia, there is no acceptance that any kind of large-scale war in our region is possible. And that breeds a deep complacency in the politicians and the citizenry here.
Right. Well, interestingly too, we've seen the evolution of the Russian military in terms of its focus on the way it conducts war, um, but the continuing themes of, when we were confronting them in the Cold War and everyone was, focused on the Fulda Gap and the 40,000 main battle tanks that were going to come surging through there. And I think people still thought there were probably 40,000 main battle tanks out there they could draw on, and it turns out that there weren't. And so they've been reaching out to these tank parks all over Russia, and now moving back into fairly ancient platforms that I guess they're using particularly in infantry support and the like. But continuing to maintain effectively these kind of human wave mass assault type strategies. Have you seen any evolution that would lead you to suspect that perhaps they'll be adopting tactics and procedures that would test the Ukrainians more in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, one of the outcomes of the Russians focusing on the Great Patriotic War, I mean, they have a societal focus on it now because, frankly, in the last 200 years, it's the only achievement of the Russians and the Soviets. They haven't achieved anything or added anything to humankind in any way except contributing to the victory in World War II. One of the implications of that is they reach back to World War II for solutions in the military. So they are continuing to do that. They rely on mass, and it is working for them. It's not World War II mass. It's a more evolved mass with drones and glide bombs and these kind of things. And mass still matters. Having more people than your adversary still matters. But to be fair to them, they have learned how to learn better over the course of the last 3 years. The Russians are very fast followers. They observe the Ukrainians, and when they see something that works, they copy it quickly. And unlike the Ukrainians, they can industrialize it very quickly at big scale. And that is a decisive advantage that the Russians have, this ability to industrialize new ideas with new kit very quickly. Alongside their decisive manpower advantage, are the two key sources of advantage that the Russians are generating at the moment.
Right. And it seems to me, a lot of that approach is just a standard sort of an attritional thing. Like, we will effectively wear down Ukraine, we'll wear down the patience of the West. And one of the major things that have surfaced from this is that the West itself industrially was geared to a certain production line approach that was very attenuated. So, we've gone through, I've talked to some US providers of ordnance who talk about having gone through 7 years worth of the production line, in the space of 12 months, etc. So sustaining that supply line, and particularly to the more really sought after items like 155 millimeter artillery rounds even. And there've been days when the Ukrainians have fired off like 5,000 rounds in a day. And here we are in Australia looking at setting up our 155 millimeter production line for the first time and looking at maybe being able to manufacture 10,000 rounds a year and with the ability to maybe ramp up to 100,000. So, there's an issue about the supply line as well. And is the West going, there's been all this information warfare activities also the Russians have been pursuing to try and erode the solidarity and support for Ukraine. Do you think if Russia is not to be dissuaded or brought to the negotiating table in any other way, is the West going to be able to sustain a support level politically and in terms of the industrial supply line?
Yeah, well, I think once Putin accepted that his fast, cheap, and easy victory was not going to occur in February, March, they started looking at a different theory of victory. And he pretty much returned to two key elements. One was that the West lacks strategic patience, and two, that the West lacks strategic industrial capacity. Out of that grew his mobilisation directive of September 2022, which most people focused on mobilising people. There was also a component that mobilised Russian industry. And he saw these were the ways that he would, realise that theory of victory. I think he's was largely correct in that. You've seen some developments and expansion in industrial capacity over that time, but insufficient. I mean, Australia set up its guided weapons enterprise before the start of the war in Ukraine, still hasn't delivered a single weapon. It took us a shorter time to fight the Second World War in the Pacific and win it than it has to set up and build a weapon in Australia. So I think, Putin is probably accurate in thinking we lack capacity and will in Western societies. And the results of the US election and the repulsive behavior of the current US administration in essentially siding with Russia
Mm.
really has borne out Putin's assumptions and views of the West, and that's why he's not going to give up. It's why he's not going to negotiate, and it's why he thinks he can win.
Right. And I guess that's been one of the most successful intelligence operations of all time, really, is the ability of Russia to kind of engineer Trump to be their agent of destabilizing Western solidarity in this respect. And it's really succeeded in the sense that, you've got the Europeans and even Australia now looking to, I guess, form a coalition of the willing to try and send those strong signals of intent to deter Russia and try and bring them to the table. But the question is how serious are the Europeans in that respect, and will it be enough to just spend that money and ramp up, or do they need to now actually put skin in the game? For example, to begin with, actually provide directly the standoff capabilities, the air support, long-range fires, etc., by their own assets. Would that get us to the table, get us to the negotiating table?
I think the Europeans are finding they have little choice, but I think we need to be careful when we talk about the Europeans. There's no such thing. When you're talking about Russia, there's the Scandinavians, there's the Baltics, there's Eastern Europe. They're three distinct regions with their own views. The Central and then the Western Europeans who also have different views. I mean, and the further west you go, the more disinterested in the war those nations become, with the exception, obviously, of the United Kingdom. But countries like Spain and Portugal couldn't give a rat's about the war. Countries in the Baltics, in Finland and in Poland care very much and have contributed a lot. So we need to be careful when we talk about Europe. Some have stepped up in extraordinary ways and dedicated huge percentages of national wealth to supporting Ukraine because they know if Ukraine falls, they are next.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in a Baltic country, I was in Latvia last year.
Right.
I mean, they have no depth.
Mm-hmm.
Latvia is, the distance across Latvia is less than the distance that my parents used to drive from our mining town in central Queensland to Mackay to do grocery shopping.
Right.
So, they understand the stakes here. They've all had to live under the Russian boot before.
Mm.
And as a friend of mine in Poland once said during a visit there, he said, Poles understand what happens when the Russians come to town. Poles leave in rail cars. And, I thought that was a very profound observation. They don't want that again.
Mm-hmm.
So they are doing what they can to support Ukraine whilst also building up their own defense capacity.
Right. And I guess the other dimension of this has been the ability of Russia through this, what I call the rectangular rat bags now, which has become incredibly tight and coordinated in so many ways, in this alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I include in there because of their capabilities. And we've seen that play out with these, North Korean and Chinese, volunteers. It reminds me a bit of the war in North Korea and South Korea. Korean War in the 50s, where the volunteer army of Chinese, about 1 million strong, crashes across the border. So you've got these, the human capital being deployed in the attrition stakes, and then in particular, despite the sanctions regimes put in place to try and cripple Russia's military capability, precursor materials, etc., microchips, all the rest of it. And the way they've kind of now constructed in their collaborations with China and Iran in particular around a lot of the ability to, and I should too highlight that Russian activities in Africa have really helped them to maintain, I guess, a flow of revenue through their pillaging and plundering of of African countries like $1 billion a year just from Sudanese gold. So the financial capabilities, they've managed to circumvent those sanctions related to that, but also now you have Iran right from the early days providing all this drone capability, the Shahad 131, 136 assets, and now building a factory in Russia to actually produce those on a larger scale directly, and Russians sort of mobilizing workers to try and sort of staff those facilities, and now trying to recruit in Africa as well to staff the production facilities. Is this dynamic of this very tight alliance now, is that really game over in terms of trying to bring Russia to the table from the point of view of making sure militarily they can't achieve their objectives?
Well, I think it's worth noting that this alignment, particularly these four, comprise a couple of important things. Firstly, they comprise a learning community where each of them is sharing lessons, not just about the battlefield, but how to avoid sanctions, how to better coerce democracies and their neighbors, how to better hide sensitive weapons programs, and these kind of things. So you have this very significant learning community, which means we're in an adaptation war with them. Secondly, they comprise what I describe as an arsenal of authoritarians, where between them they are outproducing the West in weapon systems, munitions, and key equipment. And that is a very significant concern as well. And third, they are collaborating in the biggest misinformation and disinformation campaign in the history of mankind, which is to convince citizens in democracies and citizens in authoritarian regimes that democracy does not work, that democracy is about rich people preying on poor people, and that voting for governments generally results in instability, not more stability. So you see these big three elements of this alignment of authoritarians, and between the three of them, they comprise the greatest threat to liberal democracies since ever. And unfortunately, too many of our citizens are either blind to this willingly or unwillingly, or unwilling to invest in what we need to do to protect our systems, because what we have is not the natural order of things. We've had to fight to establish it and keep it. And if we don't fight to keep it, it would be quite conceivable that by the end of this century, the number of democracies in the world is probably halved, or is even less than that, including our own.
Right. So I guess that then leads us to the question of whether or not also we can find a way to bring the US to its senses in terms of that solidarity of confronting it as formerly the great arsenal of democracy. And it's been really disturbing to not only see them pause their material aid to Ukraine, but also more disturbingly even is the halting of flow of intelligence, which underpins a lot of the modern capabilities that we've been able to provide Ukraine with. So how do you see that relationship issue with the US, and whether there are real workarounds that can actually be effective to that problem, the reliability of the US?
The reality is 80% of intelligence Ukrainians use for targeting is provided by America. And that reality would not be very different for most of us. Whether it's NATO, whether it's individual European countries, Australia, Japan, and others. That is a very profound dependence. And we have to decide whether we're comfortable with that dependence or not, or whether we want to invest in reducing that dependence. Each country will have their own view on that, but certainly that intelligence cutoff would have forced governments to look at the relationship, not just from the intelligence wise, but also the broader relationship, and say, can we rely on America or not? Now, I don't think this is a new conversation. We've been having this conversation since the alliance, the ANZAC ANZUS alliance, was signed in 1951. for the entirety of that time, Australians have asked, can we rely on the Americans to come? Because the alliance doesn't commit them to do that. It commits them to talk to us. So this isn't a new discussion. It's waxed and waned over the years. But I think, successive Australian governments over many decades have come up with ways to remain engaged with the Americans to at least ensure the best possible chance of the Americans coming to our assistance if we need it, regardless of what the ANZUS alliance says.
Right. Well, thanks very much for that conversation, Mick. Really vital to understand the general context and bigger strategic picture here. Those dynamics will really shape whether we can actually get to a short-term peaceful solution or not. So thanks for being with us, people. It's been great to be able to tease this out with you. We'll be back again for a follow-up conversation with Mick about all of the lessons learned from a military perspective and the future of warfare on the war of Ukraine, contribution to that and the evolution that's going on there. So we'll see you again in the weeks to come.